Curious about how to track your basal body temperature for effective pregnancy planning or prevention? This was seriously the best $14 that I've spent, and it has helped me naturally prevent pregnancy for the last 7 years. In this video, I'll go over how to correctly take your basal body temperature, what affects basal body temperature, what type of thermometer you need, and what it can tell you about your cycle health and overall health. Hi, I'm Mary Aline. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator. On this channel, I talk about natural ways to manage your fertility and your health. If you're tracking your cycle, you've probably already heard basal body temperature before. But just as a reminder, basal body temperature measures your core body temperature at rest. It measures your resting metabolism rate. We measure BBT because it can help us confirm ovulation, not predict ovulation. So here's what you need in order to get started taking your basal body temperature. So what type of thermometer should you use? Thermometers can drastically range in price, from $14 on Amazon all the way up to $400 for a high-tech thermometer. You do not need a fancy thermometer to get started with your BBT. You can use a digital glass or basal body thermometer. This thermometer needs to take your temperature for 30 seconds to a minute. So you cannot use just a regular quick read fever thermometer. If you're using Fahrenheit to measure your basal body temperature, you need a thermometer that just measures to the 10th place. So you need a thermometer that measures, for example, 97.5. Most of the basal body thermometers on the market will measure 97.57. And depending upon if you're paper charting or charting on an app, you can either just drop that second number or you can round up. If you're using Celsius to measure your BBT, you'll really want to make sure you have those two numbers after the decimal point. So you'll want to find a thermometer that reads to the 100th place. I'll link a few thermometers below that I recommend. Here are a few features that you might want to consider when you're looking at thermometers to purchase, but just know that you don't need any of these features in order to start taking your temperature. I've personally been using a basic BBT thermometer, doesn't even have a backlight, for 7 years, and I probably should upgrade at this point, but it's my trusty thermometer and I trust it, and I've only had to replace the batteries, and I paid $14 for it on Amazon. So just know your certified fertility awareness educator does not use a high-tech thermometer. But some of the features that you might want to consider are having a backlight in case you want to read your thermometer in the dark. I use my phone to read my thermometer, which again, probably isn't the most practical way, but it's what I'm used to. You might also want to consider a memory feature, a memory recall feature on your thermometer, which is actually super important. I would really recommend that. Most basal body thermometers will have this feature, and essentially it'll hold a certain amount of temperatures within the memory. So for example, if you take your temperature, you forget to write it down, and then you take another temperature, it'll hold the previous temperature in the memory so you can go back and put it in your chart. There are many high-tech thermometers on the market these days. You may have heard of the Temp Drop, the Oura Ring, or the OvuSense. There's a lot out there. I'm not going to spend too much time discussing these options in this video, but these devices tend to cost a lot more, and a lot of them are linked to predictive features, and that's something that I don't recommend, especially if you're using fertility awareness for birth control, because there's a higher likelihood that they're not going to be as accurate as if you are understanding your own fertility signs and charting them and tracking them on a daily basis. Also, another important thing to remember is that the gold standard for temping is taking a core body temperature. And at this time, the only wearable device that I recommend is the Temp Drop, and more specifically for people that struggle with consistent sleep. There may be postpartum or breast or chest feeding. Maybe you're working swing shifts or night shifts, or you're just having a really hard time remembering to take your temperature in the morning. These would be situations where you might want to consider purchasing something like the Temp Drop. When should you take your basal body temperature? You really want to take it first thing in the morning when you wake up, ideally between 5 a.m. and 8 a.m. in the morning. I know this isn't possible for everybody. If you consistently wake up at 9 a.m., just consistently take your temperature at that time. You do want to try to take it within a plus or minus 30 minutes. So say you consistently wake up at 7, you could take your temp at 6:30, or you could take your temp at 7:30, and it's likely not to have such a big difference in your chart. You'll likely still be able to see that temp shift in your chart to be able to identify that ovulation has occurred. I still recommend, if you wake up outside of your normal temp range, to take your temperature. It's also important just to develop the habit of every time you wake up, take your temperature, because it's so easy to get out of habit and forget. And this, again, this like simple thing can give you so much valuable information. How long should you keep the thermometer in your mouth? Some educators recommend keeping the thermometer in your mouth for up to 10 minutes. And this is pretty much to create like a baseline temperature so that your environment isn't impacting your thermometer. So say you are sleeping in a really cold room, if you just pop your thermometer in your mouth, your body is gonna have to warm it up a little bit before you can actually get a good reading. I personally don't do that. It hasn't been a sustainable practice for me. Pop the thermometer in my mouth right when I wake up in the morning, and I've had no issue with being able to identify a temperature shift in my chart. On days when it's dead of winter and it's really cold in my room, or I'm camping and it's really cold, I'll just take my thermometer and I'll put it on my chest. I'll put it like here, and I'll just let it warm up to my skin, and then I'll take my temperature. If you tend to be a little bit more sensitive, you might want to experiment with putting the thermometer in your mouth for up to 10 minutes, just again to eliminate that variable. But that's something you can experiment and choose for yourself. If you're doing that, just make sure you do that for an entire cycle. So an entire cycle would be like from the first day that you see red flowing blood, that's cycle day 1, all the way up until the day before you have your next menses or you have your next period. So just being consistent with what type of thermometer you're using, how you're temping, and any sort of other variables while you're taking your temperature. Okay, so how do you actually temp? This is the easy part. So in your mouth, there's 2 hot pockets that are just underneath your tongue on either side of that piece of tissue that attaches your tongue to your jaw. And so you just want to find one of those pockets. You stick the tip of the thermometer under your tongue. You want to be consistent, ideally, of like which side of your tongue that you're taking it under, and then you let the thermometer do its thing. You can temp orally. You can also temp vaginally with a basal body thermometer, and this might be helpful for somebody that breathes through their mouth, and so the oral cavity is going to not be like a true representation of your core temperature, and you only need to just insert a few inches of the thermometer into your vaginal canal and use the thermometer as you regularly would. Just to note that vaginal temping is going to show you the highest temps because you're like really getting a core body reading, and then oral temping, and then usually any sort of like wearable device. So again, you might notice that if you're temping orally and you're experimenting with the temp drop, your oral temps might be higher than the temp drop temps. If you're getting value from this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. Okay, so the next big question that I want to answer is, does sleep really matter when you're taking your BBT? And the short answer is yes. Some educators recommend getting at least 3 hours of sleep. Other educators recommend getting 5 hours of sleep, but we're all so different. So it's really hard to say whether you're somebody who's going to need 5 hours of sleep in order to get an accurate read, or you're somebody who's going to need 3 hours of sleep to get an accurate read, or maybe not either. Maybe you'll still get an accurate read if you're like resting in bed for an extended period of time. When clients tell me that they have disrupted sleep, I support them individually with coming up with a plan. For some of these clients, just regular oral temping works great for them. And with other clients, they may need to explore using a wearable device like the temp drop. When you take your temp, even if the situation isn't perfect, you're getting priceless information about how your body responds to our beautifully imperfect human experience. And just as a reminder, there is no such thing as a perfect chart. You'll always have a few temperatures on your chart each cycle that may be off. The goal is to understand how your body is affected by certain situations. Let's talk a little bit about what can actually affect basal body temperature. Stress, fever, illness, mouth breathing, irregular sleep, sleeping conditions, alcohol consumption, inflammation, especially seasonal allergies, food sensitivities. Anytime you travel, cross time zones, or there's a time change like daylight savings, any sort of endocrine imbalances, whether that's hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism, can impact your temperatures. Drinking anything, taking a sip of water, a sip of tea, a sip of coffee before you take your temperature. And also, if you are not ovulating, or if you're on hormonal birth control, you won't see a temperature shift in your cycle. In some cases, there are people that do still ovulate on hormonal contraception. Everybody is different, and some of these factors that I just talked about may not even affect you. Find out what factors impact you, and this is gonna, again, give you more information about how your lifestyle choices are affecting your body internally. Here are some of the things that monitoring your BBT can tell you about. First off, it can confirm ovulation. It can also tell us about an early pregnancy. If you have a luteal phase that's longer than 17 to 18 days, it's likely that you're experiencing an early pregnancy. It tells us a lot about our hormonal health, specifically about our thyroid health and about our adrenal health. BBT is great because it can help us predict when our period is, because the number of days between ovulation and your period stays fairly consistent, anywhere from between 12 to 14 days. After you identify your temperature shift, you can usually expect your period anywhere from 12 to 14 days after ovulation. And what you'll notice in your BBT is that in your luteal phase, your temperatures will stay high, and then your temperature will actually decrease before you start to bleed. So on the morning when I wake up and I notice that my temperature has significantly decreased or gone below my cover line, I know that that's a great indicator that I'll likely be starting my period that day. And so I can grab all my period blood management things that I need and feel not anxious or stressed that I will be getting a surprise. If you want to learn how to identify a temperature shift in your chart, I just recorded a video on how to do that, so I'll link that in the description below. Should you be tracking other things in your cycle? And as a fertility awareness educator that teaches the symptothermal method, I say yes. Cervical fluid, or some people call it cervical mucus, vaginal secretions are a great indicator of our fertility and can really help us determine when ovulation is likely to occur. So this is great if you're trying to prevent pregnancy or if you're trying to conceive. So learning about your vaginal secretions is another primary sign of fertility that I would highly recommend learning more about. Please like this video if you've received value from it. And as always, I hope you have clear temp shifts and super juicy cervical fluid. Thanks so much for joining me today. Bye.